So, knowledge is a really, really big concept. It's so many things. It can be how an engine works. Do you have a faith in a god? Recalling the history of the Roman Empire off the top of your head. Remembering what those things at the end of your shoelaces are called. That like spark that like helps you analyze art. Or understanding what it takes to create a revolution. It's so many things. And all of these pieces of knowledge have their own place in the world, and their own value and niches and points, where they can be put to use by different people. But what makes any piece of knowledge good? Personally, I don't think I can really answer that because I'm not a philosopher, but also just straight up because I have like my own biases about what makes a good piece of knowledge. So, before we begin like properly, I would like to note that knowledge being good is not exactly a word that I would prefer to use when using knowledge. Good is so like subjective. Would you call like the ownership of an object good? Would you call a shared resource good? It's just too general to be much use as a qualifying term. So I think the better term to use here instead of good would just be valuable. Because that's just a more specific term, and I think it captures the meaning a little bit better. Because like people value so many different things for so many different reasons. Like memories, encyclopedias, art, all these things are knowledge, and they all can be valued differently from person to person. None of them are inherently good, nor are they inherently valuable, but they can all be described as valuable much easier than they can be described as like good. Because like I think that my memories of like hanging out with my family is valuable knowledge to me, but I would never call it my memories are good, like inherently good memories. Not that I have like any like trauma or anything, to be clear, but it's rather that the value of them is more immediately recognizable than their goodness. So this clarification kind of need to get out of the way. So let's commence, have some fun, start this up. So knowledge can be generally defined as like a belief with evidence to back it up, regardless of whether or not that knowledge is truthful. Knowledge being truthful generally makes it more, or in my belief, the best knowledge is that which can like sort of promote material change and level the playing field for people, which kind of like has both practicality of like doing it and like a sort of ideological driving force behind it. We'll get into that sort of later. So, if my most valued knowledge is really just how politics works, in both the long run and the short run, what are things that don't have that simultaneous like purpose and objectivity? Let's break this down a little. There's knowledge with a lot of meaning or value to people that doesn't translate into material change that benefits them. But there's also the knowledge that has very specific material change that doesn't really translate into any sort of movement. We'll get into this later, but for the first case, let's look at like religion. So there are multiple religions that declare that life is probably going to be full of suffering. It lays out a moral framework of rules to follow so that like one person who is like in this religion or a follower can either minimize suffering or enjoy an afterlife that is blissful or just better than the one that they had lived before. They could also be sent to like a nightmarish hellscape if they don't follow this moral framework. And this is kind of just a sentiment that's like throughout most religions, like Hinduism, Christianity, like ancient Greek mythology, pretty much any religion, extant or not. My issue with this is that it doesn't really encourage people to alter hierarchies at all in the land of the living. And like the world that we know exists because we are in it, and not like a hypothetical afterlife. When Christianity overtook the Roman Empire, there were pretty much zero, if any, changes to Roman society and social hierarchy. Like, for example, when Christianity sort of became the new trend and became like the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, Roman society was not impacted in a very profound way. Like, there was still Roman slavery, there were still Roman legionnaires, there was still an emperor. It's just sort of the skin of the empire sort of changed, or the outside shell of what it looked like changed. And like the structures all pretty much remain the same. There's no like inherent like scientific revolution that happened within Rome due to Christianity. It didn't collapse entirely because of Christianity. There's like so many different factors leading to change in Rome that Christianity was kind of irrelevant. Like, the main reason that, like, there was even, like, a movement in the Christian growth at the time that was like, hey, we should not be involved in politics as good Christians. You don't operate with the goal of changing the world in a material way, because whatever happens in this world kind of doesn't matter, because you're going to go to heaven or hell or whatever, because that is the final goal. So don't bother with changing structures. That isn't going to lead to a more moralistic society. And this was basically a sort of like methodology that Christianity kind of took with it. It took with itself for centuries. Like, since after the Roman Empire collapses and the sort of medieval period rises up, the Christianity is very much just used to justify the existing hierarchies rather than change them or create a new structure. And you see this with like the sort of like great change of being, or like the sort of like divine right that a lot of kings would claim. And you would see that like the Pope had interest in maintaining this sort of structure, as Catholicism was the only type of Christianity around at this time. And you would see that all of these structures are not in any way changed by Christianity or religion in general, but they're justified by it. And if you look at, like, let's go around the world. Let's go to China during this time period. China had a very similar issue with religion. Not an issue per se, but China had a very similar situation with religion or spirituality. Because of the way that Chinese society was set up, it was basically just one giant empire for like 2,000 years. And there were like dynasty changes and stuff like that, of course. Like Confucianism and Taoism and all this, like all these cultural ideas rose and fell. But at the end of the day, throughout this 2,000-year period, the Chinese feudal structure mostly stayed the same. It was, you got your farmers, you got your merchants, you got your aristocracy, and you have the emperor or empress, depending on which dynasty is happening at the time. And these structures don't change. Like 2,000 years of roughly pretty much the same society. Not to say that Chinese feudalism is a monolith or anything like that, but the basic structures of the Chinese empire, be it Qin, Han, whatever, was pretty much the same structure throughout. And you had religion designed to basically sustain this model, like divine right or mandate of heaven, more specifically, is what was used to justify, like, hey, this emperor is like actually really chill and you should follow them. It was used to justify like the power of the emperor. Like, if there aren't any floods happening, if there aren't any earthquakes going on, this emperor is pretty chill and they have the divine right and the mandate of heaven to lord over this massive empire. And this was basically just how China rolled for 2,000 years. There were, of course, like dynasties were overthrown. There were so many wars. No, we're not going there. But like, there was never going to be a massive change that was inspired by religion. Um, China pretty much like maintained its like feudal status as basically like this country. It's just kind of structured in this like inherent way of farmers owing land to lords, to owing land to the emperor, whatever, until like the Chinese Communist Revolution and Chairman Mao rose up. Um, Very notably, communism is an ideology that seeks to supplant religion because that's basically a tool that is ideologically opposed to material change. So, communism and religion are kind of two opposite forces that are kind of pushing up against each other. You can see, like, on one hand, you have the Chinese feudal like society with like its religious structure, and that's like sort of a conservative movement of basically maintaining the hierarchy. And then you have communism on the other hand, and the Chinese Communist Party basically fighting for, hey, this is an unjust society. We're going to make it communist, and it's going to be awesome and democratic. And religion also has to be thrown out with that, like, because religion is a barrier to material liberation. This is neither here nor there. That was a bit of a rant. But the point is that, like, I don't believe that faith is necessarily a super valuable force in my eye for, like, being good knowledge. Because while it definitely helps people on an individual level, I'm not contesting that. Like, I know that there are many people who have found faith in what they believe, and that's been true for like most of human history, I'd say. It's a powerful force, but it is generally not a force for like structural change to help people like materially get better or find better conditions, because it's like mostly like, hey, accept this like 70 years of suffering. At the end of it, you're probably going to be all right, you know? And that's not super impactful. Like, even in Omelas, like that short story we read, like, you could argue that the presence of the child and the maintenance of the child's suffering is a religious factor in that society, because they have faith in the idea that this child, if it suffers, it is going to be able to maintain the idealized society that Omelas is. And you can like argue with that, and you can say, hey, I don't believe this, but the fact is that this society of Omelas does have a lot of inherent belief regarding this child, that suffering is really important, and if this suffering doesn't exist, then there is no utopia. Like, that's just how it functions as a society. And there is no like opposite force to sort of overthrow the structure, that all kind of like, it's an inverse pyramid where like everybody is like dependent on the suffering of this child, and the child isn't suffering, then the pyramid falls over. It's really, really heavily balanced on this one point. That's sort of like to get at my final point of regarding faith and religion, where, hey, I have no issue with it on a personal level. However, it does stand not necessarily in the way, but it can be used as a tool to push against the overwhelming. It can be used as a tool to push against change. And it can also be used in the inverse. We'll also get to that later. But there is no inherent quality to it that creates material change. And I mean, if you can't tell, I really value material change. Like, that's material conditions are the most basic way in which you analyze a society or an individual or a group, whatever. That's just how my brain works. Maybe I've been radicalized by the red demon in the East, but the general point is that religion is very powerful and it isn't inherently bad, but it does stand in the way of making change. On the other hand, across from religion, you have basically an inverse thing that also kind of copies the qualities of religion. This is sort of like just like raw scientific knowledge of like, hey, how does a car work? What is penicillin? How can I make this penicillin? Predicting the motion of heavenly bodies. Like stuff like that. Scientific understanding. It's really cool. I think science is awesome. You can like predict and analyze the mechanisms that govern our physical world and like develop solutions to problems using technology. But it's also not something that inherently is of use or something that is inherently changing the quality of life of people. And it's sort of like, the horseshoe theory, like of politics, where like the right and the left are actually closer than you. That's basically what I'm arguing here. Where religion basically operates under the assumption that, hey, I don't think we should change the structures of this world because this world doesn't really matter. It's like what the eternity after that. And scientific understanding is sort of unable to make change in the world. One doesn't really want to make change. The other is very much governed by like the conditions in which it exists. So let's like sort of look at something kind of fun. So nitrous oxide. So it has gotten a bit of a reputation in the past couple of years as being like a drug that people use. But it is an anesthetic used in medical operations and surgeries and all that. It was first developed by one Joseph Priestley in Britain in the year 1772. It was found to be a fun drug to inhale, and it was like used as a sort of like recreational drug by the British upper class. Apparently, people still do use it today. Fun. 44 years after 1772, it was finally realized that it could be used for anesthesia. This was an existing chemical compound that was found, but that use for it was never realized. And so many people suffered under the surgeon's knife in that like span of time. And probably before that, it's really sad, actually. Like the scientific knowledge, like an understanding that nitrous oxide or laughing gas exists, it did not inherently lead less suffering. Instead, it was sort of used in a way, well, maybe it did alleviate suffering. Those British people were having some fun. But it was never like the understanding that nitrous oxide existed did nothing to really help the people who had to like get their leg chopped off because they had like an infection in a cut. Like that, it never inherently helped them. It needs to be applied and understood. And that is sort of the issue of like scientific understanding. If it has no real application, then you don't really help people. Like if it isn't able to be applied, then you can't help people. I feel like a better way to illustrate this would maybe be like, let's look at lead. So in the late 1940s, this young guy, he's a geologist undergrad, named Claire Patterson. His professor was basically doing work trying to like figure out the age of the Earth, and he basically was like, "Oh yeah, this is gonna be duck soup, lad." And he like assigned Claire this work. It was not duck soup. It was very hard and very long and tedious work. But it was basically like measuring lead and uranium isotopes in very old rocks to determine, hey, if this is how old this rock is, this might be how old the Earth is, maybe. He did this eventually, but he used like asteroids as a way to measure the age of the Earth. But whenever he realized like these rocks that he was using, the meteorites, were exposed to air, they were like super, super fast. They were just contaminated with lead isotopes. And the primary cause of this, he realized, was because like leaded gasoline had just like popped off in the past like 3 decades as like a solution to engine knocking. So it's like you put a little lead in your gasoline and hey, you don't have to deal with like your engine breaking down a little bit more. And it was a kind of a cool invention. I mean, it's lead. But it was kind of ingenious. Anyways, so as I'm sure you know, lead is a neurotoxin. It's bad for you. Like there was a lot of research at the time that was like, lead's kind of chill for you. We know today that lead is very bad for you. Kills brain cells. You will die if you're exposed to too much lead. And Patterson was like, oh shoot, there's too much lead. I need to basically stop all this lead from being in the air and on our stuff, because like stuff like toothpaste tubes to canned foods or pesticides all kind of had like lead in them or in some form. If you're an American consumer in like the 20th century, it was basically impossible to avoid lead in like your day-to-day life. Patterson spends the rest of his life fighting the lead industry and campaigning for more regulation of just what goes into the body. This was an uphill battle in the extreme. There was this one big corporation called the Ethel Corporation, which basically was like a lead manufacturer that put lead in everything. Super big corporation. They still have a website today. I don't know, they're not really around as much anymore. They kind of fell off. But like they would lobby against like what Patterson was trying to regulate. They would like try and kick him off and kick him out of his job at like Caltech. I forget what university. He was a professor, and they tried to kick him out of his job. And eventually, Patterson lobbies, and not lobbies, but like fights and like makes a mess and a noise. And eventually, shout out to Nixon, Clean Air Act of 1970 is passed, and lead is banned all over. It finally was like completely removed from like commercial consumption and interaction in 1993. So like lead still like was a thing past 1970, but like lead levels immediately just like dropped in American like bloodstreams and pretty much the bloodstreams of everybody, because air doesn't really have borders. You can also see, notably, there was like substantial evidence linking like lead exposure to like a heightened risk of criminal behavior or violent crimes. It was a pretty cool study. I won't go into it here, but like lead being removed from like paint and stuff like that was good. Just don't eat lead. It took 40 years of fighting uphill against the lead industry to get these things done. This knowledge was amazing. Like, lead is bad for you. We know the age of the earth. And all this stuff was, like, discovered around lead. But the scientific knowledge was not inherently going to change anything. Like, you could understand lead was a neurotoxin. That doesn't mean that you're not, like, still ingesting it on a pretty regular basis. And this is like basically how I explain like this sort of inherent fallacy of relying upon scientific knowledge, because you kind of go in with the basic faith that the world will immediately spring to action and rectify any ills that it has made, when that is simply not the case. Like greenhouse gas emissions, we know those are bad. We're all going to be living in a desert in like 30 years. And that's gonna suck. We're gonna have to fight in grain wars or whatever. And we know that this is a bad thing, but that understanding doesn't inherently lead to change. There needs to be protests and legislation. And the scientific knowledge leads us to that conclusion and to that action, but it does not create change. That's sort of like we saw with Mr. McRae, that like it's a kind of a fight to get any company to support these like regulations or like be transparent in how greenhouse gases are monitored and stuff. Um, yeah, he's shout out to Mike. He's popping off. I don't really think that the his voluntary like sort of system for creating change is going to necessarily stop climate change, but it helps. And scientific understanding doesn't lend itself to easy communication. It's an uphill battle because you need to publish a paper that's like good and shows a clear link, and then you need to like communicate that to the public, and then the public needs to like care about the fact that like we have microplastics in our blood, and then we need to figure out a way to legislate that, and then we need to figure out a way to actually get a bill passed against all the lobbying in Congress. So there's like scientific knowledge is great, but it cannot create change by itself. There is application and understanding. Steam engines were in existence since the Romans, or something like a steam engine. But nobody thought to use them for doing anything other than like a fun decoration or a party trick until the 1800s, because change does not come easy, and change does not come natural. Societies change, but stagnation just tends to be like that. All right, so far I've only really been talking about science and religion as like knowledge, and I don't really think that those things are inherently valuable as like a condition of how we exist within the world. Like if you know how an engine works, that isn't necessarily going to help you if you don't have the tools to fix it. Or say you're like have a faith in something, like that won't inherently lead to like getting somewhere. That sort of change doesn't inherently happen as a result of having this knowledge. So for my final little argument, I think my biggest claim on what is the best knowledge, or at least the stuff that I value the most, is pretty much like political science, to put it in a boring way. And probably now, political science also, I wouldn't say it's like incredibly easy to understand, like its inherent value. But the thing is, all of politics is simply a demonstration of power. You have power, a corporation has power, a politician has power, a group of people has power. It's all like these relationships between these groups. And the thing is, anybody can demonstrate this power. Like, if you are able to mobilize a big enough group of people, or you are able to motivate a group, that becomes inherently valuable knowledge. Because if you understand the systems at play around you, and you understand what makes things tick, then you can create change. Now, whether it's for the better or for worse is not exactly set in stone. Like, say, scientific knowledge, where like pretty much any discovery has like some form of value, or like religious knowledge, where it like gives a moral framework. But having like an consistent ideological belief is really good for just being able to observe and react to your surrounding conditions, material, cultural, social, whatever. The simplest example I can bring forward is the civil rights movement, 20th century in America. It was spearheaded by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but there were like so many factions and groups. Like there was Huey Newton, there was Malcolm X, there was like forgetting names, but there were a lot of people. Like, and it was basically a massive mobilization of one specific group, African Americans, and fighting for equal rights. This isn't necessarily like this change was brought about from an understanding of the conditions that Martin Luther King and his patriots saw in the world. And they operated with the knowledge of how the world works. So they leveraged disruptive force in order to create change through bus boycotts, through protests, marches, all that. That is the basic principle of the knowledge that I value the most. It is you use X, where you can use any bit of knowledge and take its, where you can apply an understanding that you have of the world to reality. It might not be easy. You might get hurt, you might get killed, but it is a definite, serious application that you can always rely upon. Like if you're working at a job and you understand what the concept of a union is and you are dissatisfied with the conditions of your workplace, you can start a union. There is nothing stopping you from doing that unless it is restrictions you are going to fight against. So these are things that allows you to make change. Like understanding technical meaning of what nuclear fusion looks like does not really give you ability to make change or apply it to the world. But when you have an understanding of what motivates power and politics and momentum, that sort of thing is inherently applicable to your life because, hey, it just takes a couple words, a couple actions, and there you are. You have started to create change. It's not going to be easy necessarily. It is going to happen. That is the most important part of what makes my knowledge, not what makes. That is the most important thing that I find valuable in this type of knowledge. It is immediately applicable. In terms of religion, religion provides like a pretty basic moral framework, as well as like promises of like a better life. Sometimes it doesn't. That's not really in the point. In contrast to like religious knowledge or like sort of faith, as we'd put it, that I don't believe that to be like very capable of making great changes in the basic structures of society. But when you apply the moral framework of religion, action, political knowledge, then it becomes a very powerful force. The civil rights movement, to go back to that, relied upon religion as a great motivating factor, but also as a justification and a means of mobilization among the African American community and to the wider world. It was a massive social uprising that was pioneered through the use of religion. And that is where religion comes in terms of being able to apply change to the world as a sort of like complementary force or motivating factor. That's pretty cool, I would say. I think that both of these types of knowledge have their place, but they fail to move things in a way that political knowledge simply can do by virtue of an understanding. Like if I walked into my job tomorrow, I could reasonably probably try and start a union. I don't think I will because I don't really want to right now, but I could. And that's like the benefit that having this sort of knowledge occurs. The option to take action, an understanding of where action will lead and what its consequences will be. Not that starting a union is particularly easy or straightforward, but I could. I wanted to. So that's why I really value political knowledge. It is understanding of the systems that every person experiences in their lives and how those impacts manifest themselves in your daily life. And it also gives you the power to take action in a way that like scientific understanding is dependent on the conditions that you exist in. And a religious understanding kind of doesn't really care about the conditions that exist in at all because those are irrelevant. And like quite simply put, knowledge is at its most valuable in my eyes when it is able to be applied. I simply think it is able to be applied much easier than any other realistic thing. You can recall knowledge, sort of like data storage memory is pretty cool. Like being able to remember the history of like civil rights and off the top of your head. And that's valuable. It can be used to assist you. It's also like dependent on where you use it. If you just throw that out at like a party, nobody cares. Zero people care about the history of like Malcolm X and his fraught relationship with the Nation of Islam when you're at a party and everybody's drinking. Nobody cares. But funnily enough, quite recently, the CEO of a healthcare company, I forget the name, but I'll put it up in post, was killed. shooting. He was assassinated. The guy just walked up and shot him because let's be clear, like that guy had an understanding of the direct responsibility that guy had over the lives of whoever, like regardless of his motivations. He did have an understanding that, like, hey, this healthcare CEO, he was probably responsible for the deaths of people, so I'm going to force him to reconcile that with his actions. I believe it's United Healthcare is responsible for, had like a massive rejection rate on like insurance claims, which was pretty bad because it meant that people don't get their health care. Now, this is all due to like the private system of healthcare in America, and like we don't have single payer health care, like universal health care, anything like that. It's all like privatized everything. It sucks. I hate it. But that action was a complete understanding of the world and the actions that this guy took. So like knowledge is pretty dang cool. I'd say political knowledge allows you for understand the systems at play and all that stuff. And I'm not exactly here to like debate ideology type of knowledge. And you want to learn about the world, political knowledge is the way to go. It's understanding of the world as a holistic system. It's social movements, cultural stuff, power, economics. It's all these things just blended into one massive pot. And it's a delicious soup. It's like the soup is like positively hearty. Like it's full of nutrients. You got like carrots in there. You got probably potatoes and like sausage. It hits. Soup hits. Yeah. So thanks for listening.